Good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. I'm excited to be with you today. We are in Psalm 74 for our devotion from our Bible reading plan. And I hope you're keeping up with the Bible reading plan and writing in your journal what God is showing you, how He's not just teaching you about the Bible, but what He's showing you about living for Him, and how you're writing out some prayers in your journal from time to time, and making some notes about how you're going to respond to what God is showing you. What's the difference that it's making in your life? You need to practice that discipline, because that's part of engaging Scripture so we can encounter Jesus. All right, Psalm 74. The psalmist pleads with God to restore His presence and His blessing on the people of Israel, on Jerusalem, on the temple. He describes in here the utter destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that it had been burned to the ground. And in verse 1, it's God's doing. "O God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture?" Even though it was a foreign nation that had conquered them and burned the temple, he recognized that God had allowed it, but also that in this particular instance, God was behind it. Utter destruction. Look at verses 3 and following. He said, "Turn your footsteps toward the perpetual ruins," that the temple in Jerusalem they've been in ruins for some time now. The enemy has damaged everything within the sanctuary, within the temple. Your adversaries have roared in the midst of your meeting place. They have set up their own standards for signs. It seems as if one had lifted up his axe in a forest of trees. It's like somebody goes out in the woods with an axe and just starts cutting down trees. He said, that's what it looks like, God. They just cut down the city, cut down the temple. Verse 6, "And now all its carved work they smash with hatchet and hammers. They have burned your sanctuary. They have burned your sanctuary. They have burned the temple to the ground, and have defiled the dwelling place of your name." And he's pleading with God to fix all that, to come back and bless them. Verse 9, he said, "We do not see our signs. There is no longer any prophet, nor is there any among us who knows how long." God, we don't know how long this is going to last, this devastation. We don't even have a prophet to help us, a prophet to tell us how long it's going to last. So when did this happen? What's the setting for Psalm 74? Well, I agree with many scholars that this is some time in the years following the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and Judea, and the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which took place in 587, 586 BC. And that's the only time, other than the Romans in AD 70, that the temple was burned to the ground, totally destroyed. He says, without a prophet. Well, sometime in the year or two after the fall of Jerusalem, the prophet Jeremiah, who was left behind in Jerusalem with the small number of Jews that were left behind, Jeremiah was taken by force to Egypt, where he likely spent the rest of his life and died. So in the decades following the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem by the Babylonians, there was not a prophet in Jerusalem until after they had returned 70 years later. And likely none of them remembered that Jeremiah had preached this would last 70 years. So that's probably the historical setting. Now, one note. The introduction, the ascription, the headline for Psalm 74, a maskil of Asaph. It's an instruction, a teaching of Asaph. Asaph was the man that 350 years before the destruction of the temple, King David and then King Solomon put in charge of the music part of worship at the temple. And so this is the headline says this is an instruction or teaching of Asaph. Well, he lived, 350 years before Babylon destroyed the temple. So that Asaph could not be the one who wrote this. So what's going on? Well, we do know from other parts of the Old Testament that Asaph's descendants, inherited his duty, his job. So his descendants became those among the Levites, if you will, who led the worship, not the worship, but the music portion of the worship in the temple. And so it's possible that the author of this Psalm 74, following the destruction of the temple, was one of his descendants, or it's possible that that group of men who, as the generations and centuries past, led the music, any psalms they wrote, and these psalms, remember, are poetry in Hebrew. They don't read that way in English, but in Hebrew they're poetry, and they would often sing these as part of the worship service. That whoever wrote, part of that group that wrote these songs, these psalms, would ascribe them to Asaph, the first of their order, if you will. And so that's what that is all referring to. So I'm convinced that this is a psalm that was written after the destruction of the temple. Now, there's that. You say, okay, Steve, that's interesting. What about me today, 2023? Well, here's some takeaways for me from this psalm. They were distraught because everything was in ruins, and it was as though God had abandoned them. And all of us, well, not all of us, many of us will have moments, will have seasons in life when we feel like God's abandoned us. We will have seasons when things are going bad. They're going wrong. They're going bad. And it seems like, they accumulate one after the other. And we say, God, how long? And God, when are you going to stop? God, when are you going to heal me? When are you going to fix this? Takeaways that I think are practical. One is the author of this psalm was very honest with God about his pain, his hurt, his wishes, his wants, his desires. And I think we need to be honest with God. Too often we either get angry with God or we pretend to be happier than we are. And I think one of the principles of Scripture is that in your relationship with God, be honest. He was also respectful because we didn't read it. If you read the psalm, you will find that he recalls God's great deeds in the past, going back to creation, the establishment of the nation of Israel, and all of that. And so being honest with God does not mean being disrespectful. Okay, we can be honest without being disrespectful. That's true in our communication with others. It's true in our communication with God. So be honest with God, but be respectful. Remember who God is and who you are and what God has done. So those are some takeaways. Celebrate God's great deeds in the past. And then there's another one. Be willing to live with no answer. The psalmist, Psalm 74, he never got an answer. And sometimes you won't either. Not for a long time. Maybe never in this life. Can you live with no answer? Faith can. So what do? You keep singing, you keep praying, you keep serving, you keep growing, you keep reading the Scripture, you keep moving forward. That's what you do. Be honest, be respectful, have faith to keep singing and praying and believing and serving even when you don't have an answer. Because most of us will have some seasons in life that some have called that dark moment of the soul. The psalmist had one. You're not alone. Most of us have them at some time. Keep singing, keep serving, keep praying, keep reading. Hey, God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow.